So, this chapter will cover the primary functions of blood, its role in transportation, defense, and homeostasis. And then you should know to identify the components of blood and three major types of formed elements. So, at the end of the chapter, you should understand the characteristics of blood and be able to identify the composition of blood. So, recall that blood is a connective tissue and it is made up of a lot of different elements like red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells make up majority of the blood, and white blood cells help in the defense or immune system, and platelets help in blood clotting. So the extracellular matrix that makes up the blood is called plasma, and the main function of blood is to deliver nutrients and gases, and a lot of other components like hormones and stem cells. Apart from that, blood helps in protection. It helps in the immune response of the body, and it also helps in maintaining homeostasis. Now, the study of blood is called hematology. Hematology, right over here. So, the first function is transport. So the food you eat is absorbed in the digestive tract, but most of this travels in the bloodstream directly to the liver for being processed. And the gases that you breathe in diffuse into the blood before they move to the lung where gas exchange actually occurs. And other components like hormones that are secreted by endocrine glands, they are called hormones, and they're directly dissolved into the bloodstream and carried by the bloodstream to the target cells. Blood not only does that, it also picks up waste products from the cells and transports them to different organs for removal. For example, it takes carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide is carried to the lungs to be removed out of the body. Now, some other waste products are transported to the kidney and liver to be excreted out of the body in the form of, say, urine or bile. Now, blood also helps in the defense of the body, mainly white blood cells. White blood cells protect the body from threats like disease-causing bacteria that may have entered the body either through breathing or through a wound. So the white blood cell basically look for pathogens or disease-causing organisms and destroy them. And they also help in removing cells that may have undergone a defective cell division. So they help in removing cells that may have become cancerous or infected with viruses or bacteria. So when there's a damage to the blood vessel which causes bleeding, platelets basically contain clotting factors and other proteins that are dissolved in the plasma. Plasma, remember, is the fluid portion of the blood, and they interact with the ruptured area to form a blood clot and to prevent further loss. And then blood helps in maintaining homeostasis in the body. So if you remember, we talked about negative feedback loop. Body temperature, for example, is regulated by negative feedback loop. So if you're exercising on a warm day, your body temperature rises, and it would trigger several homeostatic mechanisms and increase transport of blood from your core to your body periphery. So this is typically cooler. As the blood passes through the vessels of the skin, heat would be dissipated to the environment and the returning blood to your body core would be cooler. On the contrary, if it's a warm day, blood is diverted away from the skin to maintain a warmer body core. So in extreme cases, a cold day might result in a frostbite. So blood also helps in maintaining fluid balance and chemical balance in the body. Proteins and other compounds like bicarbonate, which is a buffer, help in regulating the pH of the body tissues. And blood also consists of a lot of water, so it helps in regulating the water content of the cell and extracellular fluid. So this picture over here shows the components of blood in general. So majority of the blood is actually made up of red blood cells, and then the rest that you see are nucleated in here are all white blood cells. Only a very small volume of the blood is made up of white blood cells, but majority is actually red blood cells. So if you remember the blood smear that you had performed whilst looking at histology slides, you didn't see very many white blood cells. The cells you saw were mostly red blood cells. But keep in mind, this is just an artist rendition of the blood. So these over here, these dinner plate-like structures are erythrocytes, which are also known as red blood cells. And then white blood cells can be of different types. You can have monocytes, you can have eosinophils, neutrophils, lymphocytes, basophils, and these are another type of neutrophils. So all of these nucleated cells are white blood cells. And these little dust bunny-like structures you see floating around in the blood smear are actually platelets. Platelets are responsible for blood clot. So the components of this blood can be studied using various lab techniques, and you probably had blood drawn from a superficial vein in your arm, and some of the most common tests include testing for diabetes using a quick test by drawing blood, glucose tolerance test, which is performed in pregnant women, or maybe other blood tests that include just making a slide to look at the found elements. And one very common test for looking at the composition of blood is known as hematocrit or the crit. So this is a test wherein blood is drawn from your arm and then it is spun down in a centrifuge. So when you spin it down, the heavier elements in the blood separate from the lighter elements. So the heaviest element in the blood is the red blood cells. So the red blood cells get settled at the bottom of the tube, and right above the red blood cells you see a buffy coat. It's called a buffy coat because of its color, and the buffy coat, a very thin coat in between the top watery layer and the bottom dark layer, which contains RBCs, is mainly a mixture of leukocytes and platelets. Leukocytes is just a fancy name for white blood cells, and this also contains cell fragments, which you call platelets, also called thrombocytes. So only 1% of the blood makes up white blood cells. Everything else is a lot of water and a lot of red blood cells. So the topmost layer over here is the plasma. Plasma in a normal person makes up approximately 55% of the whole blood. And if you've heard of plasma and serum, serum is basically plasma devoid of clotting factors. So the volume of erythrocytes in the bottom is generally referred to as packed cell volume, or PCV. In a normal person, the PCV, or the packed cell volume, is about 45%. And this is significant because if the concentration of red blood cell is really, really high, it can make the blood really, really thick. But if it's really, really low, the blood is really, really thin. And they can also tell us about maybe blood conditions like anemia. If the concentration of erythrocyte is really, really low, it means the person does not have enough blood cells. So that condition can be called anemia. And polycythemia is a condition wherein a person produces excessive amount of red blood cells. So in polycythemia, the person might have, say, about 70% erythrocytes rather than the normal 45%. So this test can give very important, preliminary information about different blood conditions. So the formed elements are basically a combination of everything in blood apart from plasma. So the white blood cells, platelets, and erythrocytes together comprise of the formed elements in the blood. Now if you look at plasma, okay, I missed this slide. So right here you see different composition of plasma. Plasma consists of mainly water. Then it has a bunch of electrolytes for maintaining homeostasis. Electrolytes mainly include sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, bicarbonate, which comes from CO2, and the buffer, which is a bicarbonate buffer. Then chloride. All of these together help in maintaining osmotic balance in the blood. And then the blood plasma has plasma proteins, albumin, fibrinogen, and globulin. These are the most important proteins present in the blood. Albumin makes up about 54 to 60% of the proteins in the blood. And then blood also contains nutrients like glucose, fats, and amino acids, vitamins, and waste products, which is then taken to the kidney for filtration. And then it also contains respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And as we discussed earlier, it also contains hormones that are secreted by endocrine glands. Now, the formed elements include red blood cells, which are also known as erythrocytes. 4 to 6 million red blood cells are present per millimeter cube of blood, but you have only about 5,000 to 11,000 cells that make up white blood cells. So you only have 1% of the composition of blood that makes up white blood cells and platelets together. Now there are different types of white blood cells: basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. Now these further can be divided on the basis of whether they look grainy or not, that we'll talk about later. Okay. So the plasma portion is the liquid, watery portion of the blood. So when you spin blood down, the bottom portion is really dark due to the presence of red blood cells, and the top is an amber color liquid, which you call plasma. Now, serum is the fluid that remains when you remove the clotting factors and clotting proteins from the blood. So that's called serum. So there are three major types of proteins that make up that make up the plasma. So the first type is albumin, most common protein found in the plasma is called albumin. This helps in making the blood really viscous. So it brings thickness to the blood. Albumin is the same component that makes up egg white. So you've seen egg white is really thick and slippery. So that's albumin. And then these albumin proteins are made in the liver mainly. They help in maintaining the blood pressure because they maintain the thickness of blood, thereby maintaining the flow of blood. And then the next major protein in blood is globulin. Globulin make up about 35 to 40% of the proteins in blood, and they are mainly antibodies that are involved in the immune response. So there are three main types of globulin proteins. First one is an alpha protein, which is produced in the liver, beta protein, which is also produced in the liver. Alpha and beta protein together help in maintaining the osmotic concentrations. So they help in maintaining osmosis, or the concentration of solutes in the blood. And the third type of protein is the gamma globulins. Gamma globulins are the proteins that are mainly involved in the immune response. And gamma globulins are produced by the cells in the plasma. So plasma cells produce gamma globulin, and their main function is to help in the immune response. Now the last protein, fibrinogen, although it's present in a very small quantity, about 4 to 7%, they produce in the liver, but they perform a very important function. So they contain something called as a precursor fibrin, which help in blood clotting. So they help in maintaining homeostasis and prevent excessive loss of blood if, say, blood vessel gets ruptured. So fibrinogen are the main protein that help in blood clotting. So this over here is a picture of blood smear. So you can see majority of the blood smear, you see a lot of red blood cells. So this is an actual blood smear, which gives you a better idea of the components of blood. And right over here, you see the nucleated cells. These are red blood cells. And all these dust-like structures you see floating around elsewhere in the blood are the platelets. Now, the white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets all together comprise of the formed elements. We call them formed elements of the blood. And the formed elements include erythrocytes, platelets, and 5 different types of leukocytes or white blood cells. Okay, so if you look at erythrocytes, so these over here are the erythrocytes. Erythrocytes are red blood cells and they are anucleate, meaning they do not have a nucleus. And erythrocytes are produced in the red bone marrow. Their main function is to transport gases, mainly oxygen and carbon dioxide, and nutrients. And each hemoglobin molecule in the blood can carry 4 oxygen molecules. And then you have the leukocytes that you also call white blood cells. So these over here are leukocytes, but specifically they are neutrophils, which are a type of leukocyte. Leukocytes are of 2 types. So if you look at the leukocytes, you can have granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes include neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Or, just remember Uncle Ben's grainy rice: basophil, eosinophil, and neutrophils. Now, the granulocytes are produced in the red bone marrow, and they help in something called as non-specific immunity. So we'll talk about the immune response when we look at lymphatic system. But again, these help in non-specific immunity. So non-specific immunity is like a blanket immune response to absolutely any foreign invader in the body. So they're not really specific to an organism. Now, the A granulocytes are lymphocytes and monocytes. Lymphocytes are produced in the bone marrow and the lymphatic tissue. Monocytes are produced in the red bone marrow. Now, the most important cells in specific immunity are the lymphocytes, meaning they specifically attack an antigen because they are tailored to attack a specific antigen. So they are something we are not born with, we acquire it as we grow and as we encounter antigens. Then you have monocytes, which again help in non-specific immunity. So of all the cells that you see over here, only lymphocytes help in specific immunity. Everything else helps in non-specific immunity. Now, lymphocytes and monocytes are called agranulocytes because under a microscope, when they get stained, they don't look grainy. So they look really plain without too many grains on it. So these two are called agranulocytes. Now, if you go back and look at the smear of the blood, these structures, platelets, are all highlighted in blue over here. So if you look at this picture, these are all platelets. We have very few platelets in the body, and they are also made in the red bone marrow, and they emerge from megakaryocytes, a special type of cell. So these platelets, although really small in number, they play a very important role in maintaining homeostasis in the body. So hematocrit is basically a test that measures the percentage of red blood cells in the blood. Okay, so in this one over here, a normal hematocrit is 45%. Keep in mind, you can, mainly tell the amount of red blood cells in a hematocrit. So in a normal person, you have about 45% erythrocytes. Keep in mind, when you talk of hematocrit, you're not talking about the volume, you're talking about the percentage of red blood cells. If you have 100 ml solution, right over here, you have about 45% erythrocytes. In a person who's anemic, they don't make enough red blood cells, so the hematocrit is about 30%, so they have really thin blood. And then polycythemia is a condition where a person produces excessive amount of red blood cells. So you can see that the hematocrit shows a really high percentage of erythrocytes in this condition, about 70%, which is really high. So this condition is known as polycythemia. And then a not very drastic case of disease, but dehydration also leads to very low percentage. Sorry, it also leads to very low percentage of plasma. So you see very little amount of water in here, and you see a lot of red blood cells over here. So hematocrit is just a preliminary test to check for the percentage of red blood cells. And it can also be affected by various other conditions like a heart or kidney problem, intake of steroids, dehydration, diarrhea, lung problems, third-degree burns that leads to excessive fluid loss, smoking, high altitudes. All of these can drastically affect the hematocrit levels. So the concentration of proteins is very important in blood because the imbalance of protein can lead to the imbalance of osmosis in the blood, which can lead to diseases like kwashiorkor and marasmus. Kwashiorkor is an African word that means weaning disease. This occurs due to deficiency of proteins in diet. And the diet may contain enough amount of carbohydrates, but they don't have enough proteins, which leads to this condition in kids that are 1 to 3 years of age. And because of protein malnutrition, the osmosis in the blood gets disrupted, and the children they develop edema. So they have edema in the abdominal region, which leads to stunted growth and eventually mental retardation. If you see their skin is really wrinkled, and they have really stick-thin legs and a protruded belly and a bulging eye. Now, another condition that leads to similar symptoms is called marasmus. Now, marasmus is a condition wherein the subcutaneous fat is not preserved. You don't see edema and no fatty liver, but in kwashiorkor you do see edema and an enlarged fatty liver, but the ribs are not very prominent. But in conditions of marasmus, you see prominent ribs. And this is more common in infants that are under the age of 1 year. So kwashiorkor is a disease, and marasmus, M-A-R-A-S-M-U-S, marasmus is the other disease. So the number of blood cells in general, we discussed, a person has mostly red blood cells, but the 1% white blood cells can be of different types. So the 5 different white blood cells, from most to least abundant, are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Now the granulocytes are basically basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils. And agranulocytes are lymphocytes and monocytes. So an easy way to remember the most to least abundant white blood cells is to remember, never let monkeys eat bananas, in that order. So you have a lot of neutrophils. So if you make a blood smear, you'll most likely spot a neutrophil, but the basophils are really, really hard to spot because they're present in a really low concentration. So the process of blood production is known as hemopoiesis, and its formed elements, all of them are produced mainly in the red bone marrow in an adult. So we produce almost half a liter or almost a pint of red blood cells every single week. And an adult produces about 400 billion platelets, about 200 billion RBCs, and 10 billion white blood cells every single day. So the human embryo, the first site of blood formation in the embryo is the yolk sac. Okay, the yolk sac produces something called as stem cells. These stem cells have the ability to act as precursors for a lot of different blood cells. So we call them precursor cells or stem cells, and that are capable of producing a particular type of blood cell when needed. Now later in the embryonic stage, the liver becomes the most important site for red blood cell formation. Soon, when we are born, the bone marrow in an adult is the only source of both red blood cells and granulocytes. So both red and white blood cells arise through a series of successful transformation of a stem cell that are capable of generating various different types of blood cells. Now the spleen remains involved with lymphocyte production later in life. Okay. So this picture over here shows different stages of development of different types of blood cells. All cells basically generate from totipotent stem cell in the zygote and fertilized egg, and the next stage is that of a pluripotent stem cell, which gives rise to multiple types of cells. And right after pluripotent stem cells, they make mesenchymal stem cells that develop into different types of connective tissue, including fibroblasts, including bones, cartilage, and blood, but not really epithelium, muscle, and nervous tissue. Now, these pluripotent stem cells differentiate into two major types of categories. The first one is a myeloid stem cell, and then you have the lymphoid stem cell. And the lymphoid stem cell gives rise to a very special class of leukocytes, which we call lymphocytes. Now, the lymphocytes include T cells, B cells, and NK cells, which are known as natural killer cells. Now, all of these are very important in performing, functioning as cells of the immune system. However, their maturation process takes place differently from other elements of blood. So, in short, let's just understand that the T cells and B cells, they basically, well, in brief, all of them, they migrate from the bone marrow to lymphatic tissues, including lymph node, spleen, and thymus. And B cells specifically, they get matured in the bone marrow, and that's why they are called B lymphocytes. And then you have T lymphocytes that mature in the thymus of the body. And the next type of cells are myeloid stem cells. Myeloid stem cells give rise to all other formed elements, including erythrocytes, which are nothing but red blood cells. Then you have platelets that are formed from megakaryocytes. And then it also gives rise to other formed elements, including the three types of granulocytes: neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Now, the lymphoid and myeloid stem cells don't immediately differentiate into formed elements, as you can see. They go through several different intermediate stages where they first form precursor or forerunners, and later they develop or mature into different types of formed elements that we see in blood.